Claire Vonn stepped out of a black SUV at Red Mesa Airfield, West Texas, and began calculating what everything was worth. Her eyes moved down the row of weathered hangars and landed on the smallest, a corrugated steel structure with a faded sign reading Mercer Airworks. She nearly laughed. Tyler Knox voiced what she was thinking, more like a garage with wings. Inside, Dean Mercer tightened a fitting with oil-dark hands and said nothing. He had stopped explaining himself to people who arrived with conclusions already written. Claire turned away, certain this place had no future. 3 days later, the first private jet arrived, then a second. Then the runway filled completely. Why did some of the wealthiest aircraft owners in the country line up at the very hangar a female CEO laughed at? The answer had been sitting in the data the whole time. She just hadn't looked at it. Red Mesa Airfield sat on the western edge of San Marcos County, 40 miles from the nearest commercial airport, and about a decade behind everything else in private aviation. It had been a modest operation once, crop dusters and charter runs, a small community of mechanics who knew every bolt of every plane that had ever touched down on its single runway. Now most of that energy had drained away. 3 of the 6 hangars sat vacant. The runway had a patch job near the south end that had been temporary for 4 years. The fuel depot ran on a generator twice a week. What remained was functional but barely, held together by a handful of independent operators who charged fair rates and asked no unnecessary questions. It was exactly the kind of place that people like Claire Vonn were trained to look at and see a problem waiting to be solved with capital. Mercer Airworks occupied the smallest hangar at the far end of the row, number 6, a corrugated steel structure about the size of a generous 3-car garage, with a roll-up door that needed 2 hands to open and a concrete floor stained with 20 years of hydraulic fluid and engine oil. Dean Mercer had taken it over 11 years ago, shortly after his wife Paige passed, and left him with a 4-year-old son, a mortgage he had barely managed, and a skill set that made no sense anywhere except around aircraft. He had built the business quietly, without advertising, without a working website, without a single investor. What he had instead was a reputation that traveled by word of mouth through the tight network of pilots and mechanics who flew and serviced private aircraft across West Texas. He fixed things that others had missed. He caught problems before they became incidents. He charged what was fair and never padded an invoice. Claire had been briefed on Red Mesa 2 weeks before the visit. Her firm, Vonn Aero Group, was identifying undervalued regional aviation facilities for acquisition and development. The pitch was clean. Buy the land, demolish the aging hangars, construct a boutique VIP terminal with concierge-level ground services, and position the refurbished runway as an exclusive access point for high-net-worth travelers who wanted privacy without the friction of commercial airports. Her financial team had run the numbers 3 different ways, and all 3 pointed to strong returns within 5 years. There was just one complication she hadn't fully accounted for, and his name was stenciled in faded letters above a door at the end of the row. Tyler Knox, Claire's operational liaison, had walked the length of the airfield with his hands in his blazer pockets, making observations about load-bearing capacity and zoning classifications until they reached Hangar 6. He looked at the Mercer Airworks sign and shook his head slowly, the way a person does when they've already made up their mind. He called it a garage. He said the planes inside were regional junk. He said the man working inside was a hobbyist with a wrench. Dean had looked up only once when Claire and her team reached the open hangar door. He had assessed them the way mechanics assess an unfamiliar aircraft. Not with judgment exactly, but with a reading of what was there and what wasn't. He had oil on his forearm to the elbow. His shirt had a tear near the pocket. He wore steel-toed boots that had been resoled at least once. He did not stand when Claire walked in, because he was in the middle of a task and the task mattered more than the entrance. Claire had not encountered many people who responded to her presence that way, and it registered as something between rudeness and indifference. She asked whether he owned the hangar or leased it. He told her he leased. She asked whether he would be open to a buyout discussion. He did not answer that. Instead, he asked one of his own, "Are you planning to keep the old runway surface, or just keep the new lease rates?" It was the kind of question that came from someone who understood exactly what was happening and was not going to perform ignorance to make the conversation easier. Brooke Callahan, who managed the airfield's administrative operations from a small office near the entrance gate, had mentioned Dean's name during the pre-visit briefing as someone whose lease would need to be handled carefully. She had not elaborated. Claire had not followed up. Standing now in the doorway of Hangar 6, watching Dean return his attention to the engine in front of him as if she had already left, Claire decided that careful handling was an overstatement. She turned to Tyler and said, quietly but not quietly enough, that this hangar should be the first thing demolished. Tyler agreed immediately. Neither of them noticed that Dean had heard every word. What neither of them saw before they left was the small wooden sign propped against the back wall. Hand-painted in neat block letters, Mercer Airworks, with a small brushstroke of red beneath the name that a child had added long ago and that Dean had never painted over. Paige had made it the week before Dean signed the first lease. He kept it because it was the only thing in the hangar that had nothing to do with machinery. The old Beechcraft that came in 2 days later belonged to a retired airline captain named Gus Farrow, who had been flying his own aircraft out of West Texas for 31 years and who trusted exactly 4 mechanics in the state with anything that went into the air under his name. Dean was one of them, and Gus had arrived early, before the heat had settled fully into the concrete, and before the day's noise had built to its ordinary level. Because early arrivals got Dean's full attention before the phone started ringing. Gus described a noise he had been hearing on climb-out. Not loud, not consistent, but wrong in the particular way that only becomes clear to someone who has spent enough time in a cockpit to know what right sounds like. Dean listened for about 45 seconds, then walked around to the cowling, crouched down, and put his hand near the fuel line housing without touching it. He asked Gus to describe the throttle behavior at exactly the moment the sound appeared. Gus did. Dean nodded once, stood up, and said he wanted to pull the fuel pump before they did anything else. The pump, when removed and tested, showed early-stage cavitation. It had not yet failed. It would have, and in the worst possible place, at altitude, mid-flight, with no warning other than the one Gus had already been smart enough to file. Tyler Knox had drifted toward Hangar 6 during a follow-up walkthrough with Brooke's team and had watched Dean work for a few minutes, leaning against the corner of the hangar with his arms folded. He offered the observation that old-school diagnostic instincts were no longer a competitive advantage in modern aviation services. Dean did not look up. He said, without turning around, that he wasn't fixing planes to be competitive. He was fixing them so the people inside them landed safely. Tyler laughed. It was the kind of laugh people use to fill space when they don't have a response. Naomi Pierce noticed the exchange from across the taxiway, where she had been reviewing structural drawings for the proposed terminal site. Naomi worked for a firm contracted by Vonn Aero Group to assess technical and regulatory compliance across candidate acquisitions. She was thorough in a way that made her useful and occasionally inconvenient, and she had been watching Dean work since the first morning. Not because she had been asked to, but because people who knew what they were doing always looked different from people who only looked like they did. Claire had asked Brooke directly, later that afternoon, why Dean's lease had never been flagged for non-renewal. Brooke pulled up his file without needing to search for it and said simply, he paid on time, kept his space clean, and more than a dozen pilots in the region specifically listed Mercer Airworks as their preferred maintenance provider. Claire processed this as a data point rather than an argument. A dozen regional pilots were not a constituency that moved investors or shaped contracts at the level she was working. She was thinking about fleet managers, charter operators, and corporate travel departments, the clients who spent real money on consistent, scalable service. But the calls kept coming into Hangar 6. Dean rarely talked during them. He mostly listened, asked a single precise question, and either confirmed the problem could be assessed remotely or told the caller not to fly the aircraft until he had seen it in person. One call came through while Claire was still on the airfield, and she caught the tail end of it through the open door. Dean saying flatly, "Don't fly it until I see the vibration data." She did not know whose aircraft it was. She only noticed that the person on the other end had already decided to listen. Nolan Mercer was 12 years old and came to the hangar 3 afternoons a week. He didn't touch the aircraft. That was a rule his father had set early and clearly. But he handed tools, held flashlights, and listened more than he spoke. On the afternoon Claire had returned for a second look at the hangar layout, Nolan had been sitting on a folding stool near the back wall, working through a homework problem with a pencil and a piece of scratch paper. He looked up at Claire with the uncomplicated directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to frame things diplomatically, then looked back at his work. What Claire didn't see was what happened after she left. Nolan watching his father take a call from a number in another state, watching Dean pull out his own notebook and start sketching a fault diagram in pencil, working through a problem he hadn't been paid for yet because the pilot had sounded worried and that was reason enough. Nolan had seen his father do this hundreds of times. He thought it was normal. In most industries, it wasn't. Vonn Aero Group had spent 14 months building the proposal that was now, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, beginning to come apart in ways that Claire had not modeled in any of her projections. The contract was significant. A fleet maintenance agreement covering 19 private aircraft belonging to a consortium of executives who traveled collectively more than 3,000 hours per year. Securing it would validate the company's expansion strategy and open the door to at least 3 more similar agreements within 12 months. Claire had been confident. Her team had prepared a detailed technical proposal, toured the consortium's hangar facilities, and presented service guarantees that Tyler Knox had signed off on personally. The first indication that something was wrong came from a pilot named Marcus Webb, who flew for one of the consortium members and had been noticing a low-frequency vibration in the right wing during climb for 3 weeks. He had logged it twice and been told both times by Vonn's maintenance team that it was within acceptable parameters. Marcus had been flying for 17 years. He knew what within acceptable parameters sounded like when the person saying it was covering something, and it sounded exactly like that. Marcus grounded his aircraft unilaterally, filed his own incident notation, and told his client he would not fly it again until someone outside the Vonn maintenance structure had reviewed it. 2 other pilots in the consortium heard about it within 48 hours. 1 grounded immediately. The 3rd canceled at the gate. Tyler's response was fast and decisive in exactly the wrong direction. He called the affected pilots personally, described the vibration as a known characteristic of that airframe model at certain altitudes, cited manufacturer literature that was technically accurate but contextually misleading, and requested that the incident logs be reclassified from pilot concern to routine monitoring. 2 pilots accepted that framing. Marcus Webb did not. He sent a follow-up note to the consortium's logistics coordinator that was factual, calm, and deeply inconvenient. He would not reclassify his log, he would not return the aircraft to service under current assurances, and he was formally requesting an independent maintenance review. Naomi Pierce, by this point shifted to fleet compliance review after Claire had brought her on as a technical advisor, spent 48 hours going through maintenance records on the 3 grounded aircraft. What she found was not dramatic. It was methodical, which, in some ways, was worse. Substandard components had been authorized at multiple service intervals, not counterfeit, but rated at lower tolerances than those specified by the original manufacturer. In each case, the substitution had been signed off with a notation of equivalent performance, a judgment that was technically allowable under certain interpretations of maintenance protocol and profoundly inadvisable under any reasonable reading of safety standards. The person who had approved every single one of those substitutions was Tyler Knox. Claire had been in a strategy meeting when Naomi's preliminary findings came through, and she had excused herself and read the document, standing in the corridor with the particular stillness that people who knew her recognized as anger being held at controlled temperature. Warren Hale had been one of the consortium members for 6 months. He was 62, had made his money in logistics infrastructure, and had been flying privately for 2 decades. When his own pilot called to say he would not take the aircraft up until it had been reviewed by someone he trusted, Warren asked who that was. The pilot said one name, Dean Mercer, out of Red Mesa Airfield. Warren had heard that name before years ago, in the context of a different aircraft and a different problem, and the memory of it was favorable. He told his pilot to take the jet there. When Claire reached Warren by phone, he was brief and without animosity. He said, "If you want a beautiful waiting room, call Tyler. If you want your aircraft to fly, call Dean." By the time Claire arrived at Red Mesa, the Gulfstream was already on the ground and parked in front of a hangar she had, 72 hours earlier, scheduled for demolition. The Gulfstream G450 sat on the Red Mesa tarmac like an object that had arrived in the wrong scene. It was worth somewhere north of $22 million, parked against the backdrop of a corrugated steel hangar with a leaking gutter and a windsock that had been faded since the previous administration. Claire stood at the edge of the taxiway and looked at it for a long moment. Tyler, who had followed her without being asked, said something about optics and the message this sent to the consortium. Claire did not respond. Dean was not surprised when the Gulfstream arrived. He had known Warren Hale for 4 years, not well, but enough. Warren had brought a different aircraft through Red Mesa once before, a Cessna Citation with an avionics fault that 2 other shops had diagnosed incorrectly, and Dean had found the actual problem in under an hour. Warren had remembered. More importantly, Warren's pilot had remembered, and pilots talked to other pilots. That was the entirety of Dean's marketing structure, and it had just delivered a $40 million aircraft to his door without a single press release. He pulled the maintenance logs first, before he touched anything. He read them the way a doctor reads a patient chart, looking not just at what was noted, but at what was conspicuously absent, what was described in language that suggested uncertainty being papered over, what had been signed off quickly without the notation that thorough work always leaves behind. The logs were not falsified. They were just thin. Key intervals had been checked and closed without supplemental findings, in the way that happens when someone is moving fast or not looking hard enough. He cross-referenced the vibration data from the aircraft's monitoring system against what the logs claimed had been done. Tyler had positioned himself near the hangar entrance, attempting to establish that Vaughn's maintenance team had already covered this ground. Dean listened to the first 2 sentences, then asked, without looking up from the datasheet in his hand, why the pilot had grounded the aircraft if the inspection had been thorough. Tyler said the pilot was being overly cautious. Dean said he had been told, by multiple pilots over many years, that being overly cautious was the thing that had kept them alive, and that he tended to agree with them. Tyler stopped talking. What Dean found was a bracket on the right inboard aileron assembly that had been replaced with a component rated at a lower fatigue cycle than the original manufacturer specification. It was not immediately dangerous. The metal was not cracked. The stress marks were early stage. But at the rate the aircraft was flying, and under its regular load conditions, that bracket would become a serious problem within the next 200 to 300 flight hours. For an aircraft operating on Warren Hale's schedule, that was potentially a matter of weeks. Naomi examined the bracket herself, checked the component ID against the manufacturer's approved parts database, and confirmed the finding in less than 4 minutes. She wrote it down. She photographed it. She said it represented a departure from type certification standards and required formal documentation. Dean turned to Claire and said what needed to be said without softening it. A private aircraft had no interest in the financial status of its owner. It responded to physics, to metal fatigue, to tolerances and load cycles. The bracket was wrong. That was the beginning and the end of it. Claire looked at the bracket, then at the Gulfstream through the open hangar door, then at Tyler. Tyler's expression had the careful blankness of a man composing his next explanation. Warren made 4 phone calls within the hour, each to a different person whose aircraft were currently in Von's care. He didn't tell them what to do. He just told them what had been found and where his aircraft was. The man who found it was named Dean Mercer. The hangar was small. The runway was dusty. The work was right. The second aircraft arrived the following morning before 7 o'clock, while the heat was still manageable, and the light was coming in low across the Red Mesa tarmac. It was a Bombardier Global 6000, which required a runway review before landing, and which Red Mesa technically cleared for, given its length, on the high end of what was comfortable. Brooke Callahan had gotten the landing request at 5:30 and had processed it without calling anyone, because there was nothing in the rules that said she couldn't. By the time Claire arrived at the airfield at 8, 3 aircraft were parked on the apron that had not been there the day before. By noon, there were 7. The Cessna citation came in from Houston. The Embraer Phenom arrived from Austin with a maintenance flag already entered in its log, and a pilot who had phoned ahead personally to make sure Dean had time blocked for him. A Hawker 800 landed at 1:15, followed by a Learjet 60 that circled twice before touching down with the finesse of an aircraft whose pilot had been flying it for a long time and was used to having exactly the space he needed. By 3 in the afternoon, the Red Mesa runway, which Claire had assessed as a component of her redevelopment asset analysis, was occupied in a way it hadn't been in at least 10 years. Brooke stood at the window of her office and did not pretend she wasn't watching. She had managed Red Mesa for 9 years, watched it get quieter and slower and harder to justify in budget conversations. She had never seen anything like this, and after a moment she recognized what she was feeling as relief. Not about any particular business outcome, but about the thing currently happening in front of her being real. Tyler had spent the first hour trying to reframe the situation as a market overreaction, as pilots acting on incomplete information, as a temporary disruption driven by one vocal client. He said these things to Brooke, to Naomi, to 2 members of his own team. Nobody pushed back directly. Nobody agreed either. Naomi watched the flight line and said, with the neutrality of someone reading a measurement gauge, that it appeared the market had voted. It was not a pointed comment. It was a factual observation that carried its own implications without needing additional editorializing. Dean managed the incoming aircraft systematically, without favoritism, prioritizing by safety need rather than by the size of the aircraft or the prominence of its owner. When 2 requests came in simultaneously, he took the one with the more urgent flag first, regardless of whose name was on the registration. The pilots waiting on the ground did not complain. Several of them, standing near their aircraft in the afternoon heat, talked quietly among themselves in the tone people use when they are in the presence of someone doing their job correctly, and they have been reminded what that looks like. More than one addressed Dean as Mr. Mercer, with the particular inflection of professionals extending respect to someone who has earned it in the only way that survives, by being right when it mattered. Claire waited until there was a pause between arrivals and walked toward the hangar. Dean was at his workbench, making a note in the log of the citation he had just finished reviewing. She asked him, directly and without the professional neutrality she had been maintaining, why he hadn't told her he had clients like this, why he had stood in his hangar while she and Tyler talked about demolishing it and said nothing. Dean set down his pencil. He looked at her with the same steady attention he gave a fault reading on a diagnostic screen, not unkind, but precise. He said she hadn't asked. He said she had come to the airfield with her conclusion already decided and had spent her time confirming it rather than questioning it. Then he picked his pencil back up. The document Naomi presented to Claire on the morning of the third day was not a summary. It was 64 pages long with appendices, and the first sentence of the executive overview read, "The following findings indicate a pattern of systematic maintenance approval decisions that do not meet FAA-compliant type certification standards across 11 aircraft in the Vonn-managed fleet." Claire read the first page standing up, then sat down and read the rest at the table in Brooks' airfield office, which was the quietest space she could find. Tyler's approvals went back 22 months. The substitution pattern was consistent. Components selected at lower price points from a vendor list that had been expanded, under Tyler's authorization, to include suppliers whose products met broad certification requirements, but not the more specific tolerances recommended by the aircraft manufacturers. Every approval had documentation. Every approval had a sign-off. The documentation was technically sufficient to survive a routine audit. It was not sufficient to survive the kind of audit that Naomi Pierce conducted when she was already looking for something specific and had found 2 examples of it before she started. Tyler's response, when Claire put Naomi's report in front of him, was to contest the framing first. He said the word systematic was inflammatory. He said the suppliers were certified with clean regulatory records. All of this was true, and none of it addressed the core finding. He had substituted his own judgment for the manufacturer's specification on safety-critical components repeatedly, without disclosing this to the clients whose aircraft he was maintaining. When Claire said this out loud, Tyler said the aviation maintenance industry regularly exercised judgment on component equivalency, and that this was standard practice. Claire said standard practice was not the same as correct practice and that she was aware of the difference. Tyler shifted approach. He began describing the situation as a competitive attack. Dean Mercer had created a crisis narrative by coaching pilots toward alarm, had capitalized on normal customer uncertainty to pull clients away from Vonn, and was now benefiting financially from a situation he had deliberately inflamed. Naomi opened her report to page 31, where the timeline of pilot concerns was documented, and noted that Marcus Webb's first maintenance log entry predated any contact between any Vonn-managed pilot and Dean Mercer by 19 days. The inflaming, she said, had come from the maintenance records, not from a competitor. Warren arrived at the airfield in person that afternoon with 2 other consortium members. The meeting in Brooks' conference room was short. Warren did not raise his voice. He said the consortium could not proceed with any fleet maintenance agreement with Vonn Aero Group while Tyler Knox remained in an operational role. He said this was not a negotiating position. There was a second option. Vonn could agree to an independent technical review of all consortium aircraft by Dean Mercer, with findings reported directly to aircraft owners without routing through Vonn's internal approval chain. Claire said she needed 24 hours. Warren said she had 12. Dean was in the hangar the entire time, working through the queue on the apron, listening to a turbofan and thinking about the note it made on deceleration. When Claire came to find him at 6 in the evening, he was sitting on an overturned crate outside with a cup of cold coffee and a notebook on his knee. She told him what Tyler had said, that Dean was manufacturing a crisis for competitive gain. She said she was not sure, herself, whether she believed it. Dean looked at her and said, the data was wrong before he had a single new client from it. She could verify the dates herself because Naomi already had. And then he said the thing that took Claire the longest to respond to. She had the option to ride out the crisis with Tyler's framing intact, lose the contracts anyway over the next 12 months, as the pilot community processed what had happened, and come out the other end with a company that looked clean, but operated on the same logic that had gotten her here. Or she could make a different decision now, take the visible loss of the moment, and build something worth building. He said the choice between those two things was not a strategy question. It was a character question. Claire stood outside the hangar until the last light drained out of the western sky. Tyler had sent 3 messages in the preceding hour, each one elaborating his position in more detail. She had not responded to any of them. At 7:45, she called her general counsel and gave instructions. At 8:15, she walked back into the hangar and told Dean she was suspending Tyler Knox, pending full internal review and requesting his cooperation with the independent fleet inspection on behalf of the consortium. Dean said he would need 2 certified assistants and access to the full documentation package for all 11 aircraft. Claire said she would have it arranged by morning. There was a silence after that, not uncomfortable exactly, but specific. The kind of silence that follows a decision both people in the room understand cannot be undone. Dean picked up his notebook. He wrote the name of the first aircraft on the queue. Outside through the open door, the line of private jets on the Red Mesa apron sat in the Texas dark. Lit by portable lights Brooks' team had set along the taxiway, waiting with the patience of machines for the person who would, before this was over, look at every one of them and tell the truth about what he found. The inspection ran for 48 hours with 2 brief pauses, during which Dean slept for a combined total of 7 hours on a folding cot he kept for long jobs. He worked with 2 additional mechanics brought in from a certified shop in Midland, men he had known for years and whose standards he trusted without qualification. Naomi worked alongside them, documenting every finding in real time, formatting reports that would meet both internal review requirements and any regulatory inquiry that followed. The 11 aircraft produced 27 discrepancies in total. 3 were categorized as requiring immediate grounding and component replacement before any further flight operations. 7 were flagged for attention within the next scheduled service interval under enhanced monitoring. The remaining 17 were documented, filed, and cleared. None of the findings were catastrophic on their own. Several of them, left unaddressed for another 6 months to a year, would have become serious. One of the 3 critical findings involved a hydraulic component on a Learjet that had been operating with a misinstalled fitting masked by a sealant application. The kind of masking done either by someone who doesn't know what they're doing or by someone who does and hopes nobody checks. Dean found it at 2 in the morning on the second day, with a flashlight in one hand and a probe in the other. Not because anything in the maintenance records had flagged it, but because he had learned early in his career that the most dangerous problems were the ones that had been made to look as if they had already been handled. The pilots waiting at Red Mesa during the inspection period gathered in the modest crew lounge Brooke had opened near the main building, talking in the way that pilots talk among themselves, without clients present, honestly, specifically, without professional veneer. Several had stories about maintenance situations they had navigated over the years. Several of those stories involved finding problems that official records said didn't exist. The name Dean Mercer came up in this context more than once, each time attached to a specific aircraft and a specific problem that had been correctly identified and properly fixed. The media presence at Red Mesa had begun building on the second day, after a brief item appeared in an aviation industry newsletter, noting the unusual concentration of high-value private aircraft at a small independent field in West Texas. By the time Claire organized the press availability, there were 4 reporters and a camera crew from a business news outlet waiting near the entrance. She chose to hold the briefing outside, on the tarmac in front of Hangar 6, because the hangar was what the story was actually about, and she had decided to stop managing around it. She spoke without notes. She said Vonn Aero Group had identified significant deficiencies in its fleet maintenance approval process and had taken immediate steps to address them, including the suspension of the executive responsible and the commissioning of a comprehensive independent review. She said the review had been conducted by Dean Mercer of Mercer Airworks, whose technical findings had been verified by an independent certified aviation engineer. She said she had been wrong about this airfield and about Dean Mercer, and she said it without qualification and without the passive framing that makes apologies sound like reputation management. Warren Hale was standing to her left. He didn't say anything, but his presence said what words would have. When a reporter asked Warren why he had chosen this facility over larger, better-equipped operations in the region, he said the same thing he had been saying privately for 3 days. Because someone he trusted had pointed him here, and because the man who ran it had a record that the size of the building did not reflect. He said if he had learned one thing in 30 years of business, it was that the most reliable indicator of what a person would do in a crisis was what they had already been doing when nobody was watching. The reporter turned to Dean, who had been standing near the hangar door with his arms folded, and asked him to describe what Mercer Airworks was. Was it a garage, a hangar, a maintenance center? Dean looked down the runway at the line of aircraft in the morning light. Private jets belonging to people who had made their way to a small field in West Texas because someone had pointed them here, and the pointing had been right. He thought for a moment before answering, in the way he thought before answering everything, not for effect, but because he meant what he said and he wanted to get it right. He said, "This is the place where aircraft get listened to before they get pushed back into the sky." The tarmac was quiet for a beat. The reporter wrote something in her notebook. Warren looked at the runway. Claire looked at the hangar. Above the door, the faded letters of Mercer Airworks caught the early light in a way that made them, briefly, look as though they had been painted yesterday. The partnership agreement between Vonn Aero Group and Mercer Airworks took 11 days to negotiate and 4 hours to sign. Approximately the ratio Dean had expected based on his experience with how people who talked a great deal about efficiency actually spent their time. The terms were specific and, at Dean's insistence, unusual. Vonn could list Mercer Airworks as a technical partner for fleet safety review, but Dean retained sole authority over the findings that came out of his hangar, and those findings went directly to aircraft owners without routing through Vonn's operational structure. Claire had accepted this condition on the first read without sending it back to her legal team, which was the moment Dean understood that she had, in fact, changed. Tyler Knox's departure from Vonn Aero Group was managed internally and disclosed in a company statement that used the phrase transition to new opportunities in the manner of company statements about things that were actually much more specific. The internal review that followed his suspension produced a 14-page summary of approval decisions made over 22 months, forwarded to the relevant regulatory body for their own assessment. Brooke Callahan ultimately recommended against the full sale of Red Mesa Airfield, a recommendation she made in writing to the county board with a level of detail and clarity that was difficult to argue against. She proposed instead a renovation plan that preserved the independent hangar operators while upgrading the runway surface, the fuel infrastructure, and the safety systems. Claire did not contest this. She shifted the Vonn investment from acquisition to partnership. funding the runway resurfacing and the construction of a small technical training facility at the south end of the field, where aviation mechanics from the region could pursue certification coursework without driving to a city. The curriculum for the first-year course was largely Dean's. He had never written a curriculum before and had never taught formally, but it turned out both of those things were easier than finding a misinstalled hydraulic fitting at 2 in the morning, and he had done that, so he managed. Nolan Mercer was 13 by the time the renovated airfield reopened for its first formal business day, and he had spent the morning helping Brooke hang updated directional signs along the taxiway. On an earlier morning, without announcing it, he had retrieved the old wooden sign from the back of his father's hangar, wiped it clean with a rag and a little water, and remounted it above the door where the newer acrylic marker now served as the official identifier. Dean had seen him doing it and said only that he should make sure the mounting was level. It was. On the evening of the reopening, after the event had ended and the catering crew had broken down their tables and the last of the guests had made their way to their cars, Claire returned to Hangar 6 alone, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the hospitality station near the old fuel depot. Dean was still working. He was always still working. She handed him a cup and he accepted it without ceremony, put it where it was useful, and kept going. Claire stood for a while looking at the old wooden sign above the door. The letters painted by a woman who had believed in a business before it existed, in a place that most people would have written off before they finished looking at it. She said, without needing to make it more complicated than it was, that she had been wrong about this place. She said she had arrived here calculating demolition schedules and had left understanding something she had not expected to learn from a dusty airfield in West Texas, that the people who keep things running are not always the ones standing in front of glass buildings with their names on the door. Dean closed the access panel he had been working on, picked up the cup she had brought him, and looked out through the open hangar door at the runway, where the last of the day's aircraft sat in the long amber light of a Texas evening. He said what the 11 years of careful work, the pilots who had landed safely, and the runway that had just been resurfaced with money from the person standing beside him had already said more clearly than he could. That value was not measured in square footage, that the person who understood something best was not always the one with the largest office, and that a runway, like most things worth keeping, revealed what it was over time and not at first glance. Outside, a private jet climbed into the orange and rust-colored West Texas sky, its navigation lights blinking steady and true, its systems fully inspected and cleared, its pilot carrying the aircraft upward with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who had looked at it before it left the ground. Claire watched it go. This time, she did not look away.